Hello and welcome to another video showing you how to get the top grades. Today we're focusing on Tiny Tim and I'm going to do something that you might think is impossible. I'm going to try to prove to you that Tiny Tim is the most important character in the book, apart from Scrooge obviously, because I'm going to try to prove that without Tiny Tim, Scrooge wouldn't change and the message of the novel just wouldn't work. I've called him here the fulcrum because the action around Tiny Tim is what makes the magic work. Now there are two ways that we can look at Tiny Tim for our top grades. One as a representation of a real boy, and secondly as a symbolic representation who stands in for children generally and also stands in for the poor. So let's have a look at this description of him. Bob's come in and he's actually carrying Tiny Tim on his shoulders. So the illustration here is logical. This is how we would think a father would carry Tiny Tim. But it's not what actually happens in the book. Look at this. And Tiny Tim upon his shoulders. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Now you can just see this iron frame here. So these would be called calipers now, both to straighten Tiny Tim's legs and to help him walk. This is a clear sign that he's suffering from malnutrition and possibly rickets and other typical diseases that Victorians would suffer from. But these are not diseases caused by bad hygiene, they're caused by poverty. Lack of sunlight, lack of vitamin D, lack of nutrients in food. Now Bob himself is not described as a big man. He's quite small. So for him to be able to carry his son on his shoulders suggests that Tiny Tim is very small indeed, very undernourished. It's led to poor development. Then when we add in his crutch and his leg irons, we can see that in a normal child this would make him much heavier, but that seems to have made no difference to Bob. He can still easily carry him, again emphasising how fragile Tiny Tim is. Now it was very easy in Victorian society to blame the poor for their poverty. The mantra was you should just work harder, save more money, stop spending it on drink and whatever else you're spending it on, and then you can become a useful member of society. Well, Dickens wants to counter that narrative. He wants to prove that's a load of rubbish. And the easiest way to do that is to choose a child and say, look, a child is totally innocent and yet is still the victim of poverty. Dickens also tries to show that the poverty is not the fault of the poor, just as Tiny Tim can't be blamed for his disabilities. That is precisely why he makes Tiny Tim disabled. So if Tiny Tim doesn't just represent himself, but he represents how the poor are disabled by their poverty, we can see that that's at the heart of the message of the novel. And when we get to the end of the novel and we look at Scrooge's transformation, we're not just looking at this as a story of Scrooge, we're looking at Scrooge as representing the well-off reader who needs to change their behaviour in order to benefit the poor. The whole point of having Scrooge in the novel, apart from making it hugely entertaining, is to convince the reader that they must change just like Scrooge does. Now there is one aspect of Tiny Tim which might upset you. It certainly used to upset me. Let's have a look at this quotation to see what I mean. So Tiny Tim is walking around in church, obviously struggling with his leg irons and his cane. And this is what Bob says about him. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. So Tiny Tim sees himself as delivering a Christian message, that Jesus and God loved everybody. That message is also that the congregation should therefore also love the poor and those in need of support, and therefore give charity, and become more like Scrooge at the end of the novel. Now a modern reader might find this a little bit sickly. We're uncomfortable seeing these sorts of words put into the mouth of a child. It doesn't feel very realistic, does it? Even worse, we might feel that if he really believes this, It suggests that God has kind of chosen him to be a cripple in order that he can teach Jesus' message to the congregation. You know, we can imagine parents teaching their disabled children that their disability is all part of God's plan. And for us, that feels deeply uncomfortable. But consider what it was like for a Christian in Dickens' day. What would you say to your disabled child? God dislikes you? You deserve it? No. You'd have to find a way to explain your child's disability and suffering in terms of your religious belief. You'd have to say somehow it was part of God's plan. And because of this, Dickens is suggesting that part of God's plan is that we, those who are better off, need to learn to support those who are not so well off. Part of God's plan is to change our attitude towards the poor and needy, just as the ghost's plan is to change Scrooge. Tiny Tim also seems to totally accept his condition. This stoic form of acceptance is perhaps also seen by Dickens as wisdom, to accept the things you cannot change. Although, of course, it's wisdom for Tiny Tim, it isn't wisdom for the readers, because Dickens is telling them they can change the life of Tiny Tim, which we'll see when we get to the end of the novel. Now, the next quotation comes to us from the wrong place in the novel. It just doesn't work within the universe that Dickens has created. Let me show you what I mean. Scrooge has just asked if Tiny Tim shall live. But who does he ask? He asks the ghost of Christmas present. This ghost is to show Christmas now. In the universe of the novel, the future belongs to a totally different ghost. But this is what the ghost of Christmas present says. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race, returns the ghost, will find him here. Somehow the ghost of Christmas present is able to tell Scrooge that Tiny Tim will die before next Christmas. Then he uses Scrooge's own words against him. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Now, Dickens has to put this moment with the ghost of Christmas present because, of course, the ghost of Christmas yet to come cannot speak. So he can't make this political point. But the fact that this happens in the novel, going against his own universe, because the ghost of Christmas present has no business seeing the future, proves how important Tiny Tim is. And the fact that this moment shouldn't appear in the novel, but Dickens feels he has to put it in, is another pointer that Tiny Tim is the fulcrum around which the action develops, and the moral story. The other big clue, of course, is that we have 5 staves, 5 chapters, and when does this moment happen? It happens right in the middle where the fulcrum should be, in chapter 3, stave 3. We can also see that Tiny Tim carries Dickens' political and social message. He uses Tiny Tim to attack the political belief that the poor were a burden on society. You'll remember this is the view called Malthusian, and Reverend Malthus believed that the poor created a demand for food and resources which the country simply couldn't produce. Without unproductive people like the poor, everyone in society would be better off. So Reverend Malthus therefore proposed that the poor should delay marriage and they should delay having children so that they wouldn't create more poor, unproductive members of society. He, of course, favoured education as a way out of poverty. However, politicians at the time ignored Malthus's solution and instead took the message that they were an economic drain on society and created horrifying solutions: prison, transportation, and the workhouse. The idea being politically that if we made circumstances as unpleasant as possible for the poor, they wouldn't be able to have so many children, those children would die in greater numbers, and the poor themselves wouldn't live long enough to keep draining society of money. Now, when Dickens creates Tiny Tim, he's trying to create a human face for the poor. And it's the same actually with the whole Cratchit family. Here is a family that's all desperate for work. It's just that the way Victorians pay the lower classes in society is so poor that it's really difficult for them to lift themselves out of poverty. And it's only once Scrooge understands the human face through Tiny Tim that he is moved to change his ways. Now this is going to become really important later in the novel when we meet the Ghost of Christmas Future, because the logical thing to assume is that the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come is going to be the one who persuades Scrooge to change. But I'm going to argue, no. Scrooge starts to change right here in stave 3 when he starts thinking about what's going to happen to Tiny Tim. Now, if we look at this scene with the Cratchits at their Christmas time, it's very much played for laughs. And Mrs. Cratchit doesn't want to say a good word about Scrooge, but Bob insists because it's Christmas Day. But Dickens gives the last word to Tiny Tim. So they're all drinking a toast to Scrooge. Tiny Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party. The point here is a symbolic one. Scrooge represents all employers who choose to underpay their employees. After all, you might ask yourself, why does Bob put up with Scrooge as an employer? And the reason is the amount he gets paid is not worse than he'd get paid in other employment. So although in the novel Scrooge is a terrible miser, symbolically Dickens is saying all Victorian employers are terrible misers. They all pay their employees far too little, which is why we have such extreme poverty in Victorian society. So when Scrooge becomes the ogre, the monster, it's not Scrooge the man who is the monster, it is Scrooge the employer. Dickens is making the point that it is employers who are monsters. And who will these employers be? Well, they'll be the readers of the book. Those of you who've watched my other videos know that the book was priced at 1/3 of Bob's weekly salary, 5 shillings. Hugely expensive. So the average man in the street would not be buying it. It would be bought by the very well off. And again, it is Tiny Tim who sees Scrooge as the ogre here, because he is the fulcrum around which Dickens' political message pivots. We can see this not just as an urge to get people to contribute to charity, but to pay a decent living wage. Tiny Tim also helps explain the rather bizarre appearance of ignorance and want. So the Ghost of Christmas Present has pretty much done his job, showing Scrooge everything going on at the time, Christmas Day, to persuade him to change. And then Scrooge notices these 2 weird children hiding inside the ghost robes, and he doesn't see the children, he just sees their claw-like hands. The ghost explains that the boy is ignorance and that the girl is want. These are clearly symbols. They symbolise poverty through want and the lack of education through ignorance. Again, the ghost gives Scrooge a warning about the future, and he says, beware ignorance most, and links ignorance to doom, not for the children, but for society. Well, again, that's a job for the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come. It's seeing into the future, but this power is suddenly stolen by the Ghost of Christmas Present, because Dickens wants to link the theme of childhood, poverty and ignorance, poverty and the lack of education, to the same chapter in which he's dealing with Tiny Tim. This is Dickens' way of saying to the reader, look, I'm not just writing about Tiny Tim as this pathetic little character who I'm going to kill off to get your sympathies. I'm writing about Tiny Tim because he represents all children who are suffering from extreme poverty in Victorian England. And notice that Dickens focuses on ignorance as the worst. Hidden inside this book is the message that the most important way to help the poor children that is through education. Hopefully you know about Dickens' involvement with the Ragged School movement and that he devoted a lot of energy to try and educate children of the poor. So this ghost again carries Dickens' political message. Scrooge says, do these 2 children have no refuge or resource? And the ghost simply uses Scrooge's Malthusian words against him. Are there no prisons? Said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. Are there no workhouses? And of course the answer here would be schools. Now the next way that Tiny Tim becomes so important is when he's compared to the turkey. So this turkey is twice the size of Tiny Tim. It shows us exactly why Scrooge is buying the turkey. It is to save Tiny Tim's life. Now here are some astonishing statistics for you. It's been estimated that 60% of the children of the poor in Victorian England suffered from rickets because they lacked vitamin D, and another 50%, perhaps even, and 50% had some signs of tuberculosis or respiratory disease. If you type infant mortality 1850s London, the first fact that comes up is that 30% of all children had died within the first 5 years. And that's not just children of the poor, that's children in society everywhere. So Tiny Tim isn't just an overly sentimental character that Dickens has introduced into the novel. He's actually incredibly real to the readers. All Dickens readers would have known children who had died far too young. Now remember I told you that Dickens readers would have been very well off. Well, the other characteristic of well-off people is that they would have been highly educated. And this comparison of Tiny Tim to the turkey, which the family are going to eat, remember, is a literary reference to a really famous pamphlet written by Jonathan Swift. He's the guy who wrote Gulliver's Travels. So a very famous author that Dickens readers would have read when they were children. But he was also a political author, so he wrote this fantastic satire about the poor in Ireland, in which he seemed to set out an economic proposal that would cure poverty. And his proposal was this: if we paid the poor for fattening up their children so that the rich could eat them in special banquets, you know, special treats like Christmas, for example, where you get to eat an actual human baby instead of turkeys, then the poor could be paid for having children, which would lift them out of poverty, and therefore society would improve. Now, although this was suggested as a satire, it was so well written that lots of people at the time thought it was an actual economic plan that he was suggesting, that this was an actual idea that would work. And actually, financially, it probably would. And Dickens is invoking this idea because it's a symbol of how the wealthy literally feed on the lives of the poor. The poor have to stay poor in order for the rich to stay rich. That's just how the economics of the situation works. And the after effect of that is that the poor will therefore die. So Swift's argument and Dickens' argument is exactly the same. A necessary condition of the rich enjoying their wealth is that poor children will die. And so symbolically, the wealthy are feeding off the lives of the poor. This literary allusion also helps us understand why Dickens has given Scrooge the particular business which he has. Scrooge's business is money lending. He lends money to the poor, that's why they need money, and then charges them sufficient interest for Scrooge to make a huge amount of profit, which of course makes the average poor person even poorer because the money costs more than its value. In this way, Scrooge is feeding off the lives of the poor. Through this comparison of Tiny Tim to the turkey, Dickens is dramatising that feeding, that exploitation of the poor, and also setting up a very real solution. Actually, what if, as a society, we thought about feeding the poor so they wouldn't be malnourished, so children like Tiny Tim would not die? And Dickens has another way that Tiny Tim is the fulcrum of the novel. At the end, we are told that to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. Scrooge becomes the father that he himself as a boy never had. And this points to the psychological fulcrum, turning point if you like, in Scrooge's character. That was the job of Christmas Past, to explain why Scrooge as a human being has become so cold and distant. It is because his own father was so cold and distant when Scrooge was a child. By ending his book this way, Dickens is saying that we all have a second chance to put right the things that went wrong in our own lives. It's also a symbolic description that we as wealthy readers have a social duty to become fathers to the poor. In other words, to help them grow up. if the poor are like children, they need to grow up to be adults who will be useful members of society. And the only way for us to achieve that is to help them grow. Now, just in case we haven't got the message that Tiny Tim is the most important character in the book, Dickens makes it absolutely obvious again, and he gives the last words of the book to Tiny Tim. God bless us, everyone. Now, to us, that might just seem like a nice way of ending it, but to Dickens' Christian readers, the meaning is much more profound. He's reminding his readers that it is their Christian duty to help the Tiny Tims of the world and to help the poor rather than exploiting them. He also gives these words to Tiny Tim because Tiny Tim is the moral teacher in the book. That's why Dickens started with the description of Tiny Tim in church, trying to teach the same lesson that Jesus taught. Because, hey, that's what Christmas Day's about. Remember that? Tiny Tim gives us the last word to remind us of our Christian duty on the most Christian day of the year. It's not all just about family, turkeys and presents. It's about doing what Jesus would want us to do. Now, I'm pretty convinced that you can bring Tiny Tim into any single essay about any character or theme, and you can now explain how he is the fulcrum of the novel, so vital to Scrooge's change and to Dickens' political and social message. And the top grades are now easy. If you'd like more videos on how to get top grades on A Christmas Carol, check out the videos appearing on the left, or indeed on the right, or sometimes in the bottom left, but never in the bottom right. Something else goes there. I don't know what it is. Anyway, see you soon on my channel. Goodbye.